Hello, and thank you for joining me, Ruth Rule-Mullen, partner and head of public sector employment at Forbes Solicitors, to talk to you about post-lockdown and going back to school from a staffing perspective. In the current times, COVID-19 or coronavirus, as we've got to know it, has become the biggest challenge in a generation, not just for the UK, but for the world at large. The priority is health and keeping people safe. And that's never truer than in the sense of returning to school, where you're going to have to consider protections for staff, pupils, and also parents and visitors. There is a severe impact on the economy and to our daily lives, which has affected all types of businesses, but in particular schools, as we've seen the first shutdowns of schools that I've ever known in my lifetime, and probably you've ever known in yours. We need to look very carefully at how we return to school. And if you've seen the press recently, you'll have seen there's been a lot of concern about what that's going to look like moving forward. The government guidance has come out in force over the last couple of weeks. And I have to admit that every time somebody says that there isn't enough guidance out there, I cringe, particularly on a Friday night when more guidance is released and you have more work to do. That said, it is going to be incredibly important for us to have guidance which is going to help us in going forward. So the main headlines I've documented here for you, which is schools are due to return week commencing the 1st of June, but only for nursery reception, year 1 and 6, plus years 10 and 12 with some face-to-face support and remote working. The plan is that further groups will be included in the second phase, plus potentially colleges and universities. In terms of getting to that stage, there is going to be significant planning. At the present time, it's an ambition, as stated within the guidance, for all primary schools to return for a month before the summer, if it's feasible, and this remains under review. We've heard from the government that this will happen as and when they think that the science permits. But it's key to remember that the guidance is talking about if it's feasible, and a lot of that is going to depend upon the planning that you do. These returns of pupils to school will be in addition to those vulnerable children and children of critical workers, where schools have remained open to accommodate those children through the current stage of the pandemic. The guidance, it's important to remember, doesn't supersede legal obligations, but if you follow that guidance and maintain any existing obligations that you've got, it's going to be very difficult to prove that you didn't act reasonably, reaching the decisions that you have. It's going to be important to document key decisions, especially risk assessments, for making judgments about how and when to act. It's not clear when the final decisions will be made about whether or not opening on the 1st of June will actually happen, or whether there'll be subsequent extensions to the proposed rules and when that might happen. But it's important to ensure that you follow the guidance as far as you can, whether or not that means you're going to open on the 1st of June, because in reality, even if it's postponed, it will be the case that you're going to have to plan for a return at some point, whatever that looks like. So really important to follow the guidance, even though it's non-statutory guidance. So moving on to consider the points about planning and preparation, what is it that schools need to do to help with that? Well, I would say that the planning and preparation is going to be key. It's going to be really important to ensure that you've taken the steps to plan and to document those plans and communicate those plans. Firstly, one of the things that the guidance says is there's to be no rota system for a daily or weekly return to school. I think that early on there were discussions about whether or not you could return some children on a rota basis to ensure that there was sufficient space and capacity for teaching those children, but the guidance is quite clear on that point, that that is not how they're expecting it to unfold. Risk assessments and consultation will be absolutely key with your key decision makers. It's vital before reopening or opening to a wider school population that the right people make the decisions at the right times. The situation for that is it needs to be considered who your key decision makers are, and that will very much depend upon the type of school that you are. If you are a maintained local authority school, then that will need to be done in consultation with your local authority. If you are a multi-academy trust, depending on the scheme of delegation, it's likely to be the trust board that will make the decisions on opening. But at the moment, it appears to be widely reported in the press that different local authorities in different areas are taking slightly different views on the reopening of schools. So we've seen currently some areas are saying that they're not going to open at all by the 1st of June, except in some cases for vulnerable children and critical workers' children. And other local authorities have taken the decision that they will open at a time that they think is safe once they've carried out the relevant plans and the relevant risk assessments. So it's a real mix of when people will return or might return. And a lot of the planning will involve the head and the senior leadership team, but it must be remembered that they may not be the key decision makers in this, but of course they will have operationally the most influence on what is going to happen within the school and how to manage it at school. And it's important to say that the Department for Education has indicated that any authorities or schools that decide not to open will not be penalised for taking that decision. And it's also been clear in the press that if parents don't have the confidence to allow the children to return to school, then there won't be fines issued for refusal to do so. It's clear, though, that the expectation is for schools to work closely with parents, with staff, unions, and their local authority where applicable. And the next stage for preparation is preparing the site. And the guidance goes into some detail about things that you might consider as part of those preparations, including if your school has been closed or partially closed, undertaking a health and safety check, making any necessary adjustments to fire drill, and undertaking practice in the first week of return, particularly where that fire drill might look different, but ensuring that anybody that is in the building is familiar with what the fire drill is to be going forward. The second really important point is, of course, cleaning and hygiene. And I'm sure that by now everybody's very, very familiar with the cleaning of door handles and things like toilets, desks, equipment. Are we going to need more cleaners? Will there be more cleaning hours required? Will you need an increase in supplies? So those are all things that need to be taken into consideration. There also needs to be clear expectation set out to parents, children of staff as to what is expected from that. It's important that all frequently touched surfaces are to be cleaned thoroughly, and you will need to consider what will be needed for frequent hand washing and location of things like hand sanitizer and washing facilities. For example, you're going to need them in the classroom, and are those things available? And also there's been mention in the guidance of having lidded bins in classrooms to support the catch it, kill it, bin it methodology of hygiene. And then the next part of preparing the site will be to deal with movement around the school. So there are a number of areas covered in the guidance on this, and the main thrust of that advice is to try to reduce contact between different groups of children and adults. It's recognised that it may not be possible to keep younger children 2 metres apart, but where that's possible, you should be endeavouring to do so. I know that's been a particular bone of contention in schools, because it's understandable that young children, particularly who haven't seen their friends for some time, are going to want physical contact, they're going to want to play together, and that is going to be difficult. That's recognised within the guidance, and that's the reference to trying to establish different groups of children and adults. The idea being that you reduce the groups into smaller groups who have consistent staffing with them, so that you can effectively isolate those groups should they become ill, and it will also minimise the risk of transmission. You're going to also need to consider what the staffing is for those groups, and the guidance does talk about that if you don't think that you're going to be able to split your classes or have sufficient staffing to allow you to open, that if necessary, you might discuss that with your local authority or trust, depending on your type of school. And of course, independent schools will go to their key decision makers as well, because there may not be enough classrooms or space available in the setting, simply because of the design of the school. There's been talk that solutions might be expecting children to attend a nearby school, and if that can't be achieved, the priority is for settings to have flexibility and provide places as a priority, firstly to, of course, the vulnerable children and the key worker children, and then as follows. So early years settings, 3 and 4 year olds, followed by younger age groups, infant schools, nursery and reception, primary schools, nursery where applicable, reception and year 1. And it's very clear from the guidance that it's going to be revisited when the science indicates it's safer to invite more children back to school and colleges. So you're also going to need to consider how and where lunch breaks will operate. Some schools have determined that they're going to offer packed lunches, and those are going to be presented to the children within their classrooms, supervised by the same adults. Other schools have told us that their welfare staff are committed to coming into school, and that they might allocate them to specific groups so that they can support the lunch breaks. There's going to have to be staggered pick-up and drop-off times, which will come inevitably with some difficulties around parents who are working or who have there are siblings within the school, and those are matters which will need to be consulted on and decided in conjunction with what's workable. The discussion about split classes, within the guidance, the suggestion is a maximum of 15 children. It's clear that lots of schools feel that that number is too high. The unions have also indicated that they believe that figure is too high, and it is going to be based on a case-by-case basis upon the space that you have within your school. It will depend upon your site and having sufficient staffing to supervise. It's also going to be important to minimise the resources that are used and to ensure that you've got sufficient equipment for cleaning and providing those resources safely. So, of course, the next important thing is to look at the staffing resources that you're going to have. So, firstly, I'm going to recommend that you undertake a staffing audit. Consider how many staff you're going to need to physically work on site. It's interesting that since the lockdown started, many organisations have managed to roll out a lot more working from home, a lot more flexibility and a lot more agile working in a situation where this has just had to happen. So it may well be that some of that can still be adopted to allow you to continue with some of that moving forward. So in terms of that staffing audit, it's possible that the most sensible thing to do is to look at the classes and groups that you intend to return and start with an audit of the staff that's associated with those groups. Some schools have written to parents first to ascertain their confidence in the children returning to school and to gauge an accurate picture of the numbers anticipated to return, because of course that will have an impact on the number of staff that you're going to need to physically work on site. And I would also say it's sensible to consider, will the return of some of your teachers to school or teachers in general increase your critical worker children numbers, because teachers and teaching staff and teaching assistants will be classified as being allowed to have their children return as critical key worker children. So if you've not had all of your vulnerable children at school previously because it's been possible for them to remain at home, the guidance suggests that you should be encouraging their return now, and that similarly will increase numbers and might impact on the staffing that you're going to need and the resource that you're going to have to provide to the additional groups of children. So the second thing that you're going to need to consider is how many of those are required, or can they be advised to remain at home? You may have certain staff who will have to potentially remain at home for a while longer, and if they fall into the categories of staff who are due to return, you may have to look at changing your staffing around to accommodate that. So those that are clinically extremely vulnerable, and this applies to staff and also to pupils, are advised not to attend work or school. The guidance contains a specific explanation of who fits into the extremely vulnerable category, but those are the individuals who generally have received the letter from the NHS. The second category is those that are clinically vulnerable, and they will require extra care in social distancing and to work from home where that's possible. If a member of staff lives with an extremely clinically vulnerable person, then there has to be extra care in social distancing, and they should be allowed to work from home where possible, but you'll need to ensure consideration of whether they're able to follow the guidance for supporting that person at home if they are actually attending work. And those that are living with clinically vulnerable, and I would remind people that clinically vulnerable includes pregnant people who are in stages of pregnancy, those people are recommended where they're working themselves to remain at home if that's possible. And if they have to work at school, then you'll be expected to put them in the safest place possible. And if somebody lives with somebody who's clinically vulnerable, and including somebody who's pregnant, they can attend work. But again, you'll have to make sure that they can do their best to socially distance and do that in a safe way. I think it's important to say at this point that it's going to very much be a case-by-case basis assessment. You're going to need to examine each staff member's circumstances individually, discuss it with them, and try to alleviate concerns. And in terms of working from home, education settings are expected to support this, and that's clear from the guidance. Look at the ways that you've already managed this by supporting some streams of work that you've already developed because you've been in the situation that you've had to. There has been a lot of reports of people teaching remotely and virtually. I include myself in that category, being here today, recording this via Zoom for you. Planning and preparation at home, setting of work, staff meetings, training. Think also about the use of equipment. It's going to be important to manage working remotely and working from site, probably for a period of time until the government allow a wider opening of schools. So think about the equipment that you have. What are you going to need? If you've got enough tech equipment, and you're going to need to do things like limit the taking home of books, and where physical equipment such as books and resources are being used, ensure that they are cleaned fairly rigorously and people make sure they maintain hygiene. So we then move to staff availability, and if your usual staffing for the prescribed classes can't attend, you might need to allocate your staffing of classes differently. You cannot, under the current guidance, invite different class groups. So if you have a position where, for example, your class 1 teacher isn't able to attend at school because they're extremely clinically vulnerable, then you can't say, well, we'll invite class 2 instead. But what you can do is reallocate your teachers across any year group, because they can, of course, teach in any year group in primary school particularly, and you're going to need to utilise teaching assistants and leadership as necessary. The guidance suggests that where classes have to be split, it will be acceptable for teaching assistants to be present in a class and have a teacher teaching remotely, or have the class split into 2, for example, and have the teacher supervising both groups, but the teaching assistant physically present with the other group. It will be really important to keep workload under consideration. It's difficult to know how much workload there's going to be, but one expects with the extra things that you're going to need to consider, the hygiene, the things that are going to take time, it may well increase the workload. And also remembering to manage the remote working for those pupils still not at school at the same time as managing to teach the children who are at school. There's also no requirement to reopen breakfast and after school, but you can do so if you can keep children in groups they've been allocated to during the day, and you can ensure, as far as possible, social distancing. So not a requirement, but something that you can do. And thinking about working from home and staff availability, the next most important thing, of course, is working flexibly. Flexibility is going to be critical in planning for a partial return and at a later stage, a fuller return. Flexibility is going to be more important now than it's ever been, because people are going to be required to do things differently, to work in different ways. And a real positive that comes out of the situation that we've been faced with is to see how many staff have actually been really positive about working in a more flexible way to ensure that we can keep going. And that's going to remain key critical going forward. The removal of set time limits, or the fact that a change becomes permanent, could be something that could be reviewed in your flexible working policies to allow more flexibility during the pandemic, and would be in the interest of both staff and schools. One thing that you will need to remember is if those policies are collectively agreed with your unions, there may need to be some consultation about any changes to the policies. Also, consider the staff who have their children at home, or if they have a caring responsibility. As I mentioned earlier, support and teaching staff are considered critical workers, and as such should be in a position to return to work because their children will be eligible for a place at school regardless of year group. I would just add to that one of the key concerns that's being raised with us in our live Q&As week on week is what will happen to those staff who just aren't feeling confident of returning to work because they don't want to send their children back to work. There is scope for you to give them unpaid leave during that period. But again, I would urge you to look at, are there options to allow that person to continue working from home, working more flexibly to support the work that you're doing? And if not, you will need to discuss with them the position that will leave them in. Unfortunately, this is not something that the government have appeared to address, other than to say they'll be entitled to a place for their child at school. Throughout this, it is going to be a case of having those discussions with your staff and doing what you can to alleviate their concerns. I think it's fair to say everybody's concerned about how this is going to affect them. And I think more now than ever, it's going to be important to bear that in mind, to try and reassure staff and to keep them involved in the planning stages. And another key aspect will be managing health and the well-being of staff. As I've said, it's going to be really important to understand an individual's circumstances. Everybody has got concerns with their own health, their own families, and what's important to one person will be different to that which is necessarily important to another. So it's going to be absolutely vital that you have those conversations, that you're able, where you can, to reassure staff. That's going to be key in terms of sharing plans and allowing people to raise the issues that concern with, and seeing if you can address and alleviate those concerns. I think the intention behind the guidance is that we try to alleviate concerns and try to work together to find a solution, rather than going down a disciplinary route, which is going to be a last resort if staff don't want to come back. You're going to need to engage with them during the planning phase. Getting that engagement at an early stage is going to be really helpful to allowing you to understand what their issues are and what can be done to address any concerns they have, which might then make it much easier for people to return. And maintain an effective communication channels with those on site and those who are working remotely, and also those who are absent through self-isolation or shielding is going to be absolutely crucial. You're going to really need to watch that remote and absent workers don't fall through the gaps when you return to school. As busy as it's going to be, and I appreciate that is going to be hard, you know, it's going to be really important to keep that going. And then moving on to the next point on that is getting to know your staff, assessing their needs, any health issues they've got, and really understanding on an individual basis what the concerns are so that you can address them. You're going to need to consider any ongoing disabilities somebody has and identify any new ones. What I mean by that specifically is we've heard a lot in the press about mental health and well-being during the period of lockdown, and it's quite possible that more of your staff are going to be more anxious than they have been before, and this might lead to further conditions that would amount to disability. And it's important to remember, of course, that mental health can also amount to a disability, and you do have legal obligations, positive obligations, to make reasonable adjustments for anybody who is suffering from any form of disability. You will need to utilise medical evidence. One of the questions that we were asked at a Q&A this morning was, could you request evidence from somebody who has the NHS letter and is considered to be extremely clinically vulnerable? And my answer to that would be absolutely. You should be obtaining evidence to support the decisions that you make, so that you can rationalise those decisions and make proper reasoned decisions. Also utilise occupational health. If there are questions raised by your staff member, or you have questions about what can be done to assist them, then you should be utilising that assistance. And also utilising employee assistance schemes and any counselling schemes where necessary, and signposting staff to that will help them to engage with you, but also to help them to manage coming back to school and those who aren't yet able to do so. And again, following on from that, I suppose communication is going to be, again, absolutely important. Keeping communications frequent, making sure that you communicate virtually and in writing. We're all getting much better, I hope, at presenting things via Zoom, using Microsoft Teams, for example, where we can video call and actually communicate as close to being face-to-face and in person as we possibly can. Revisiting your policies, looking at things like your behaviour policy or how you're going to demonstrate hygiene and what the expectations for that will be within school. Make sure if you're amending policies that you explain what those are going to look like, advise on those policies, give training where that's going to be one of your key policies to rely on. The government guidance, Annex C, contains a number of posters to help you to put information around school to ensure observance of hygiene, hand washing, and what people can do to help. There's also signage being released by Health and Safety, and that tends to be included within most of the guidance as well, about keeping the 2 meters distance and other things that can be done to support the return. If staff are undertaking different responsibilities or roles, you will need to consult with them. It's something that's easy to forget in a time where everybody's under immense pressure to try and make things work going back into school, but it's going to be incredibly important that you consult with your staff. And if you are making changes to their contracts of employment, then you will need to go through a formal period of consultation, and depending how many people are affected, you might need to enter into collective consultation by unions and staff representatives. So keep that in mind. You will also need to confirm that in writing and provide any support that's necessary. I think it's important at this stage to make it clear that you're not necessarily going to be scrutinising performance management during this period, because it is going to be an immeasurable time of change and doing things differently until we get through the crisis. Make sure that you notify early of timetable changes, make it clear what everybody's going to do, and make sure you're documenting those things as well. And just wanting to touch really on the union perspective that we've been able to ascertain. The NASUWT have published on their website that they want schools to step back from the 1st of June and work to create conditions of a safe return. I don't think anybody would argue with their first principle of safety and welfare of pupils and staff as being the paramount principle. I think all of you out there are probably working towards that as we speak. Their list of requirements is set out here on this slide. Those are a number of things that they're expecting to see, and I expect that if the unions believe you are not meeting with these requirements, then they will be looking to challenge your school on the decisions that you make. So again, it's incredibly important. We're not saying you can't make decisions. You must be making decisions, but you must be documenting those decisions and being able to rationalise the reasons behind those decisions to demonstrate that those are reasoned decisions to take based on the guidance, based on the normal principles of health and safety and your legal obligations. And I think all unions are concerned about the return to school because they don't believe it's safe. And generally speaking, they're rejecting the proposed date of the 1st of June. However, there are some differences between what different unions are going to to expect. They generally don't accept social distancing is manageable for the groups that have been proposed. I think the government have tried to amend the guidance to address those issues, and I think that, again, it's a matter for you looking at in your particular school what you think will be manageable. They have also talked about the need for stringent hygiene measures and the importance of that, and I think we've already touched on that to a great degree here. I have to say, this is my summary of things that I've read that the unions are saying, apart from the part that I've actually quoted from the NASUWT. I think it is important at the present time to try to work together with the unions wherever possible, because I think everybody's committed to a common goal of trying to return to schools safely. And I think that needs to remain the focus. But we are going to have to look towards returning at some point, not necessarily the 1st of June, but people are working towards that. And I think it is incredibly important that you continue to plan in that way. And one of my training sessions wouldn't be complete without the issues that might occur and the potential claims that you could potentially face for breach. So some of the unions have already intimated that they will be looking to consider these claims if they feel that the health and safety measures are not being followed properly. And that is in relation to Section 44 and Section 100 of the Employment Rights Act, which talks about if an employee is dismissed or subjected to detriment in circumstances of danger which they believe to be serious or imminent. It's going to be, as I said, incredibly important to make those judgments and document those judgments so that if those sorts of claims do come, you will be able to demonstrate the steps that you took and how you acted reasonably to avoid that. That is part and parcel of the consultation with staff and trying to address any concerns that are raised. Those claims do have quite a high threshold to meet for the employees to be successful in, but certainly they are something that you should be aware of. There's also been an indication from some unions that they will try to pursue a breach of duty of care or personal injury claim on the basis that there was a foreseeable risk of injury due to the coronavirus. Again, that's something that you will need to seek advice from your legal representatives, your insurers, and those who are responsible for taking the decisions to ensure that you're satisfied that you're managing those risks appropriately. The other two types of claims that might occur is that you can bring a claim for whistleblowing. So if somebody reports a health and safety concern to you and that isn't actioned, or they're subjected to a detriment because they reported that to you, they face protection from being dismissed or subjected to detriment. And also constructive dismissal. If somebody feels that they're forced to resign because they don't believe that you've upheld their contract by acting inappropriately or not observing health and safety, then you may find that such claims are intimated. I would, though, sincerely hope that at this time people can try to work together and work flexibly and understand each other's concerns with a view to trying to address them and allow us to return in a safe way as soon as that's practical to do so. I just want to say that I've added a couple of slides with the additional guidance on that's come out in the last couple of weeks. This will only be current probably fairly briefly, but I thought it was useful to highlight those. I would say that if anybody has questions or needs advice, as always, we're available at Forbes to try and support you as much as we can. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this useful. My details appear on the screen in the event you do wish to contact us, and we look forward to hearing from you and sharing information about further training sessions in due course. Take care and stay safe.